So my freshman year of college, I had to take a course in biology. I had no interest in biology or science or math. Well, I mean, I had a passing interest. I liked learning the conclusions and dreaming of the stars and quantum physics and Euclid and all that, but I wasn't interested in doing science. I wanted to solve the questions, like the meaning of it all, not how it all worked. So I took this biology course as a pass-fail, with the intention of missing as many homework assignments as possible and still get a passing grade. But the first class, the professor started talking with, cell structures, and I was immediately thrown back to fifth grade. The cell was this little circle with a membrane and the nucleus in the center and all the little differently shaped blobs kind of floating around in the middle. And in fifth grade, we had to painstakingly draw or sculpt each organelle and then label them with these tiny little flags. And my big handwriting was so large that I could never fit the name of the thing that I was probably mislabeling anyways on there. So I was ready for a painful semester. But the professor began speaking about mitochondria, and I will never forget this. See, every living thing in the world has mitochondria in their cells. So this includes rabbits and rats and flies and peanut worms and Japanese dogwood trees, poinsettias, shiitake mushroom, your childhood dog, LSD, koi fish, lichen. You get the picture. Every complex multicelled organism has this organelle, which is known as the powerhouse of the cells. In essence, it's this mitochondria is this thing that is creating liquid energy. And that's amazing enough, right? That this thing that's inside of me is inside of every single other living thing. But there's more. So every mitochondria has two cell membranes, and this is strange because most organelles only have one. And if there are any true crime junkies here, you probably know that mitochondria have their own DNA, which is different than other DNA found in the body. And that DNA is inherited solely from the mother. So that means that mitochondria are hiding within us a matrilinear history. And red blood cells, they don't have mitochondria, so that's why DNA tests sometimes don't match up. Anyways, the professor explained to me that one theory to describe mitochondrial weirdness is that mitochondria, at some primitive age, were an independent being, a bacteria of sorts. And so when anything enters a cell, it does so by pushing its way through the cell membrane, getting wrapped up in that such that it protects the cell from this thing. So if a bacteria that has its own membrane is to enter into a cell, it would end up having two cell membranes, just like the mitochondria. Additionally, the bacteria would have its own DNA, just like mitochondria. So it's believed that all complex multicellular life cannot function without mitochondria. And that blew my mind, and it still does to this very day. The only reason any of us is around is because this independent being entered the body of another independent being, merged with that being, so much so that none of the living things in the history or prehistory of our world would have been alive, or at least not in this form. So if this theory of mitochondria is true, then mitochondria are hands down the most successful beings in the history of Earth's evolutionary history. Now, I was still who I was, a child of poetry and philosophy, and I still struggled through biology. But I had a realization that fundamental truths about the nature of the universe could actually be located in the results of scientific inquiry. Now, obviously, as you use, we believe this to one degree or another. In modern society, it's hard not to analogize the discovery of science to the human condition. And we know we should be careful. Science has been used analogously as well as directly to perpetuate some of the most horrific behaviors humans have ever done. Evolution was used to justify slavery, and genomic science has been used to justify eugenics. Science has played a prominent role in warfare and genocide, oppression, and destruction. Whether through directly producing the means of harm or by producing the analogical justification for harm, science is not just this neutral body of facts that requires no ethical or political considerations. That said, it would be impossible to live in our modern world and not have science shape the way we consider the world and its meanings. While the theory of evolution was used to justify racist and misogynistic programs and policies, it also helped shape our relationship with the natural world. It also introduced a dogmatic belief that survival of the fittest was the scientific ground for progress as such, and that we were encouraged by that to dominate nature and by extension each other, right? So if everything out there is maybe fighting for its offspring at the expense of others' offspring, then maybe brutal exploitation is only natural, and maybe we should make sure that we are in control of the forest before the forest comes and survives over us. But evolution has also enlightened us to the way that we are deeply linked to each other as creatures on this planet, coming as it were from a common set of ancestors. Because survival of the fittest was the most compelling of concepts at the time, money and research went into that self-affirming study, often leaving the theories of evolution, other theories of evolution, underfunded, ignored, hostily mocked. The study of symbiosis and ecology and the interconnection of life recently begun to emerge in mainstream consciousness as a scientifically founded principle that can inform how we live. And so thinking of mitochondria gives me a sense of a scientific grounding to our seventh principle beyond just evolution. I sometimes worry that we have stopped incorporating scientific knowledge into our cosmological understanding after evolution. So for those of us who have forgotten, the seventh principle is the respect for the interdependent web of all of existence of which we are a part. And I'll note that the principle says existence, right? Not life, not environment, not world, but everything that exists is an interdependent web that demands of us respect. Now, it's a powerful principle. We often think about the interdependent web relating to the environment, but it is primarily because science and knowledge that we most often are exposed to nowadays are about ecology and the environment. But this principle is about more. It is saying that even those things which are not at all connected explicitly to the environment are connected to us too. The stars, the nuclear particles, the dark matter, the electrons and neutrinos, all of these belong to the interdependent web of existence that we are a part of. So the mitochondria in all of us, and all of the plants, and all of the trees and sheep and dogs is first and foremost a story of deep interconnection. I am not me if I don't have mitochondria. Mitochondria has no existence outside of the cell. We have merged so thoroughly such that it is impossible to differentiate one from the other. So true, I possess a multitude of mitochondria, and true, I contain a number of different elements that also work toward my metabolizing and my continued existence. But we can also say that I'm equally one of many creatures existing in this space and time. I interact with these other things, and I am integral to certain communities, such that without me, that community would at the very least be very different in the same way that I rely on all of these things around me for life. So our seventh principle, I believe, tells us that all things just are their relationship to other things. We are all our relationship with things. And so much of this is hard to talk about because for many centuries we have been given to understand ourselves as singular individuals, fully possessed with an individual will, interacting with singular and disconnected things. But what happens if we begin to acknowledge that the I, who interacts with the world, is actually just a bundle of relationships to everything else? Not just an independent being, but a being made up of relational parts. And so I will give us an example. Our bodies are filled with bacteria and fungus. There are about as many human cells as there are non-human cells inside of us. So the bacteria in our guts is a major source of unconscious relating behavior. Our gut bacteria influences our stress management, our cognitive functioning, our social interactions. So now, thinking of this makes our belief in a singular individual making a decision independent from anything else a lot more complicated. If the bacteria in my gut interact with my cognition unconsciously, is it me or is it my bacteria making the decisions? It won't work in court. Now, sure, we could say this is my microbiome, but even the my in that statement is questionable. Who is the me that is this my? Our gut bacteria also produce serotonin, which regulates our mood. So even our feelings are generated and in some sense felt through this microbiome inside of us. So I say, forget the so-called questions as to whether or not animals feel pain or plan for the future. We don't feel solely through our own selves. We feel through a collection of flora and fauna that live within us. And here's the crazy thing. Many animals like cows and dogs and kittens also have the same bacteria living in their guts. So we're all mitochondrial having beings. We all share bacteria, and that bacteria helps us to feel, think, plan for the future. In many ways, we are all connected through our guts and through our cells. And this is, to me, the profound thing about the seventh principle. Almost prophetically, the seventh principle projected or at least made space for a world that is shot through with relationality. There is no me without relation to mitochondria or our gut bacteria or to each other or even at the microfloral exchange in the ultimately wider world. So all of this radically changes the cosmologies and theologies of the past. No longer can we view humans as the top of creation, closest to God in the great hierarchy of being. Neither can we position humans as the top of the evolutionary development or the top of the food chain. No longer can we say that we're the only feeling beings or even the only rational beings. So only recently with the global climate crisis have we really begun to speak as though we are interconnected with the world in a mass culture sort of way. We know that our actions here can have impacts on ant populations in the Congo, which then can turn have harmful bird population problems and then a cascade of effects. But that just feels kind of like a distant sense of relationality, a sort of mystical causal chain. To me, knowing that all of us share serotonin-producing bacteria, or that every living thing carries within it an ancient bacteria as part of itself, that to me is the wow thing. That makes me take seriously the interrelated web of existence and the scientific data that shows us that we are just so thoroughly our relationality, such that we can be described as an intersection of many beings who are themselves, an intersection of many beings who are themselves, an intersection of many beings, and so on, and so on. So we can't continue to hold on to a cosmology that is premised upon a schema of the universe that sees humans as the top and most important individuals that at most owe an ethical or practical consideration of the rest of the organic and inorganic world. Science has moved on. The Earth desperately needs us to move on. But old habits die hard. Feelings and interrelationality binds us each to each, such that this, great cowboy individualism of the American imagination reveals itself for what it is, a desperate fantasy, the last gasp of a cosmology that saw humans as the center of creation with the will to dominate the earth. So just as Copernicus upended the view of the universe that places the earth at the center, to me, so too does the symbiotic life and ancient bacterial mitochondria upend any sense that we are disconnected individuals with a limited connection to earth around us. Perhaps we could read all of ecological history as the story of the success of the mitochondrial bacteria taking over the planet, with humans as its unwilling servant. Our seventh principle is not a creed, it's not a dogma, but it is a principle that requires that we re-examine any belief that would ossify our existence into non-relational or independent existence. And the science both metaphorically and actually backs this up. Implicit in everything we do is our belief as to the fundamental structures of reality. Our principles and our science call us to observe and adjust these cosmologies to live in a world that is so deeply interrelational. And this means that when we think of the climate crisis, we do not fall into the trap of believing that the cure is ever deepening the well of our supremacy and dominance over nature, any more than we still think that the cure of heart disease is prayer. It means that when we think of ourselves as connected to the trees and the birds and the cockroaches and the water and the stars, and we weigh our choices in relation to that web. It means that we look at the non-human other and we don't try to fool ourselves that the non-human other doesn't feel or doesn't plan for the future, because it is the non-human other within us that makes feeling and planning possible. And I think of our water communion here at USR. It's a ritual which I'm very fond of and which I think expresses some of the best of the seventh principle and UU life. We gather waters from all our meaningful places. It may be the tap in your kitchen, your hearth, it may be the headwaters of the Mississippi or the cool Pacific waters or the water from the swimming pool where your youngest learned how to swim this last summer. We gather these throughout the year as discrete little parts of ourselves, little prayers to matter that makes life on earth possible. And we bring this all together here and we pour them all together. And all of that water comes together both as individuals, but also as one at once. It is a communion from below, from the primordial waters, to remind us of our shared life. So I say, let us try to take time each day to experience that interconnection with each other, to see our cats and our dogs as sharing our life, to see our shared life with the squirrels and the spiders too. All that lives is part of us, and we part of it. And what could be more holy than that? Amen.